Thank you for joining us for tonight's conversations with the clerk, talking about the actions of the 226th General Assembly back in the summer of 2024. The Assembly adjourned on July 4th, and we're sitting here on October 22nd, and it feels like been a really long time. And it has been. Lots of things have happened in the in between, and actually, there's some things related to General Assembly that have happened in that in between. But do want to just take a few minutes and walk through the actions of the assembly. I want to especially draw your attention to a great handout that's available on the PCUSA website, and I'm going to put a link to it in the chat that's more direct to it. The General Assembly staff have put together a handout called Assembly in Brief, and it's a kind of traditional thing, and it's a 8-page bulletin insert style event thing that lets you learn about what the General Assembly did this summer. And I must confess my great debt to it in preparing tonight's conversation. So, as I mentioned before, we have actually had one conversation with the clerk already, talking about one of the proposed amendments to the Book of Order and talking about General Assembly's actions around divestment and Israel and Palestine. And though will encourage you to go back and watch the YouTube video on that if you have not, and if you're interested in those topics. We'll also have one additional conversation with the clerk coming up in January to talk about the other amendments to the Book of Order. So tonight we're talking about the other things that the General Assembly did. And I, thanks to the Assembly in Brief, have kind of put those into four categories: leadership, national unification, social witness, and structure. And so we'll start with leadership. The election of leaders is an important part of every General Assembly. The General Assembly elects members to national committees of the church, and it also is responsible for electing our national leaders for the church. So each General Assembly elects a moderator or co-moderators to lead the assembly and to represent the assembly in the life of the church. This General Assembly elected C.C. Armstrong and Tony Larson as its co-moderators. C.C. and Tony are ministers from South Carolina in two different presbyteries, and they are a dynamic duo. If you've got to watch any of the assembly live stream online, you saw that they worked together really well. Tony was adept at parliamentary procedure, as was Cece, but Cece was always leading the dance routines at the assembly to kind of help the assembly take a deep breath. But together they brought a wonderful spirit to the assembly. It's important to note too that they led the assembly and will actually also be leading the next meeting of the General Assembly, because one of the things that this assembly did was make a change to the standing rules so that the new moderator of the assembly or co-moderators will be elected at the conclusion of the assembly. So we'll talk a little more about that later, but I want to point that out. They'll be the first ones to actually kind of moderate two assemblies, and probably the only ones. So another important leadership role in the life of the church is that of the stated clerk of the General Assembly. Each council of the church has a clerk, clerk of session, stated clerk of Presbytery, Synod, and General Assembly. And every 4 years, the General Assembly elects a stated clerk. This person is the chief ecclesiastical officer of the church and while we don't have a presiding bishop or a pope, this person does sit at table when there are gatherings of what's called head of communion from different denominations from around the country and around the world. This assembly elected Ji-Hun Oh, a minister member of our own presbytery, the Presbytery of Greater Atlanta, to serve in this role. Ji-Hun has previously served as a pastor here in Atlanta, been a chaplain. She and just finished a term working in the national office, in the office of the General Assembly before she took on this role. And I must confess that Jihan and I were in seminary together, so we have known each other for quite a long time. And I consider Jihan a friend, so I'm grateful for her willingness to serve, and I'm excited about what she's bringing to this role. Jihan has also very recently been appointed as the executive director of the Interim Unified Agency of the Presbyterian Church USA. I'll talk a little more about that in a minute as well. This assembly also did, in it, I mentioned, elected a number of committee members to national church committees, but it also affirmed other agency leaders. The president of PCUSA, a corporation, which is kind of our corporate entity at the national level. Kathy Lukert was elected to a second term in that role. David Dobson was elected to a second term as executive leader of Presbyterian Publishing Corporation. And Claire Lewis was elected to her first term as the president of the Presbyterian Investment and Loan Program. So all of these persons will continue in these new roles going forward. The General Assembly also, I don't have all my notes on this, but the General Assembly also approves seminary presidents and celebrates with them as they take on those roles. And there were several seminary presidents who were approved at this General Assembly. The second big topic I mentioned was unification. The unification of two major agencies at the national church. The General Assembly in 2022 took an action to begin the process of unifying the Presbyterian Mission Agency and the Office of the General Assembly. The Presbyterian Mission Agency is the historic organization at the national level, historic agency at the national level, that is responsible for missional and programmatic activities at the national level. So when you are looking at the work of mission coworkers around the world, or you're learning about Presbyterian Youth Triennium, things that are happening that are programmatic or missional, that's happening in the Presbyterian Mission Agency. The Office of the General Assembly is primarily responsible for ecclesiastical and ecumenical functions. They keep the rolls and statistics. They support the call process. They provide our points of relationship with other denominations across the country and around the world. So, starting in 2022, there was a process to begin to put all of those responsibilities under a single agency. And that continued in 2024 with the General Assembly approving a unifying budget. Historically, these two entities have had two separate budgets, and then there was a third budget for the A Corporation. PCUSA A Corporation is the corporate entity that manages the corporate affairs of those two agencies. And so the General Assembly this summer approved a single budget for the years 2025 and 2026 for the Presbyterian Mission Agency, the Office of the General Assembly, and the Administrative Services Group that functions as the corporate support for those two groups. There was not a lot of other unification work that happened at the General Assembly this year, but it has continued after the assembly, and I would not be helpful in your understanding of what's happening if I didn't give you this little bit of extra information. In 2022, the assembly created a unification commission that is responsible for all of this work. They report to the assembly, but they do most of the work, but without the assembly's approval. The assembly gave them the authority to do it. So they have announced that the board, the mission agency board, and the committee on the Office of the General Assembly, the two groups that supervise those two agencies will end their service on December 31st of this year. The executive director of the mission agency, the Reverend Diane Givens Moffat, will be ending her service on October 31st of this year. And as I mentioned before, stated clerk Reverend Ji-hun Oh has begun service as the unifying executive director of the new agency that's yet to be fully crafted and created. It's going to be ongoing with the preparations for that culminating in 2026 when everything will be fully established and there will be a manual presented to with all of the details of that to the General Assembly then. There are some staffing changes that are expected as well before the end of this year, and that was included in the budgeting process. Let me pause and ask if you have any questions about the leadership actions of the Assembly or the unification work of the Assembly. You can always come back later. I'm happy to loop back if we need to. So, but we'll continue on. The next big topic I mentioned is social witness. Betty, did you have a question? I see you unmuted yourself.
I don't like what happened in the last week.
Hmm.
And I knew something was coming, but I don't like what's behind it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's all I'm going to say. And to let someone go on October 31st as opposed to December 31st, I find that very interesting as well.
I appreciate your
There's
perspective.
politics behind everything that's happening.
Mm-hmm.
As though one can't follow it, as one didn't know when you set up a commission, that a commission can do it. And then to turn around and give you see, I'm saying the former state clerk of our General Assembly, who is, I'm talking about Bob, I can't think of his name now. I'm talking about the former United Presbyterian Church, would turn over in his grave if he knew this was happening.
I
Why
deeply
would we have a job like that? Why would you give a stated clerk several different kinds of responsibilities?
I certainly appreciate your
Yes. Oh, okay.
I appreciate your perspective and and I can't say anything more than that because I'm not involved in it anymore. I just
I,
sharing the information. So uh yeah. And I will say that you know that it is a sudden thing in many ways and there are big changes and more than anything I am in prayer for all the staff and all the work that is being affected by it. Because I think there are humans being affected by it, and there's work that's being affected by it, and we just need to be in prayer for them. So, um, yeah. Well, we'll talk a little bit about social witness. The General Assembly has had a long history of doing work around social witness policy and helping the church to bear witness to the world on important matters that are before us. And so they took a couple of actions. I mentioned that in our previous conversation we talked some about the actions that the assembly took on divestment and fossil fuels, that sort of thing. But there were a few others that are worth lifting up. Again, I'm indebted to the work of our national staff who have put together that helpful assembly and brief guide. Um, and so I'm going to lift up what they shared because I think that's very helpful. And they're the places where the assembly spent the most time and of its discernment and hopefully will be reflected in the church's work going forward. So the first one to mention is that the assembly approved a statement rejecting Christian Zionism and asking for a broader study document on that topic. The there's a lot of work that needs to happen around that to help clarify our understanding of how there is a clear distinction between biblical Israel and the modern state of Israel. And so we want to make sure that that's a part of that understanding and to make sure that we're talking with our international partners because we have folks around the world who we are in relationship with, our Christian siblings who confront the spread of Christian Zionism on a regular basis. And we need to make sure that what we say and do supports their witness as well. Another overture was approved, calling for this overture was concurred with by the Presbytery of Greater Atlanta, but it was approved to call for action so that children may live free from gun violence. There was specific action mentioned in that around secure gun storage, ending gun marketing to children, around prayer, and working and voting to support gun safety. The Assembly also acted to add Transgender Day of Visibility to the Presbyterian planning calendar on March 31st each year. And just to briefly remind you of the discussion and action around investment on fossil fuels, that the Assembly directed the Committee on Mission Responsibility Through Investment, MRTI as it's sometimes known, to continue their work around socially responsible investment efforts and to identify the top 10 fossil fuel companies that derive most of their profits from the exploration, development, and production of fossil fuels that we are not going to be able to bring out further conversation with them around ways to be responsive to our engagement and to go ahead and divest from those companies. So they're working on that. And they're going to continue our divestment process is built around corporate engagement. So to use and leverage the resources that we have in our church, in our investments at the national level, with the Board of Pensions and with the Presbyterian Foundation, to to get us to the table to be supportive of people as they seek out different understandings of the of how the world can be at work around fossil fuels. So that work continues. And on top of all that, the divestment process in general has been named as a space for review, and that was put forward by the Assembly. So our work around divestment was shaped and formed by some very successful work in the 1970s and 1980s to bring about an end to apartheid in South Africa. And the practices we follow today are largely modeled on that. And so but we know as well that there's some things have changed since 1984 when the current policy was put in place. And so the Assembly has asked for a review of the divestment process to help make it more relevant to the church of today. Again, I will pause and see if you have any questions on those questions of social witness. There were certainly other actions taken by the Assembly, but those are the ones I'll lift up. But if you have other questions, feel free to ask. I will use this as well as a moment to mention that all of the actions of the General Assembly from the since 2006, actually, I believe, are available on a website called PC Biz. The link is www.pc-biz.org. And this site was built to collect the actions. Before the assembly, it replaced two 4-inch binders that were given to each commissioner and advisory delegate, and uh, incredible amounts of paper that were being distributed on a regular basis at the General Assembly. So hopefully we've killed a few less trees, although some might wonder whether the carbon footprint has changed all that much with the expense and care for electronic materials. But it is helpful to be able to access this reference on an ongoing basis. So PCBiz is available at any time. It's for free, doesn't require any kind of login. You can log in and get some and save things and that sort of thing, but it's helpful to learn a little more about the assembly and the actions they took. You can see the final text of each action and the text that as it kind of made its way there with all the amendments, if you're curious about that. So that takes us to the last of the big areas that I mentioned, and that's structural matters. So this assembly did take a number of actions related to the structure of the PCUSA, other than that unification work that I mentioned. So, first of all, it approved an agreement called the Episcopal Presbyterian Agreement on the Local Sharing of Ministries. This is designed to enable elements of the Episcopal Church and the Presbyterian Church to serve locally. It's not full freedom for ministers to move back and forth like we have in some cases with other denominations, but this would allow very specific local sharing. So the bishop of an Episcopal area could call on a Presbyterian minister, and with the presbytery's approval, that person could serve in an Episcopal church, and vice versa. That will be coming to the presbytery for ratification in February. So we'll be learning a little more about that in the coming weeks and months. And that is a continued step toward that full communion agreement that we hope will be coming at some point in the near future. Another big structural change that came out of this General Assembly was a series of changes to the Presbyterian special offerings. If you recall, we currently have 4 special offerings: the One Great Hour of Sharing offering, the Pentecost offering, the Peace and Global Witness offering, and the Christmas Joy offering. So the Assembly approved a change that will be effective all these changes effective in 2026, that we will move from 4 offerings to 3 offerings. The Pentecost offering will be phased out, and the causes that are supported by it will shift to the Christmas Joy offering. The Peace and Global Witness offering will be renamed the World Communion offering because it's generally collected on World Communion Sunday. The other big change is that with a couple of our current offerings, congregations and presbyteries are asked to keep a certain percentage of what is received. In the new structure, that will no longer be the case, but instead, all the offerings will be remitted to the national church, and there will be grant programs made available for churches to apply and receive funding through that. Another big structural change is all related to presbytery boundaries. This is about as nerdy Presbyterian as you can get. First of all, the General Assembly this year approved an incredible series of 16 items of business that state the boundaries of each presbytery. Amazingly, we didn't really have a good digest of all that in one place. It happened around the time of reunion. It happened at different times. It was recorded in different ways. We have one of our national staff who works in technology is a former cartographer, and he was going to try to make a map of our presbyteries, and he looked at the information we had and said, I can't make a map based on what's there. So he helped give us greater clarity on that. This also, I must note, did impact the Presbytery of Greater Atlanta with our agreement and approval. The General Assembly approved the shift of Lamar County, one of the counties previously in the Presbytery of Greater Atlanta, and Barnesville Presbyterian Church in Lamar County to Flint River Presbytery. In addition to all of these clarified boundaries, the Assembly created a new permanent administrative commission on mid-councils. This group is set up and designed to make it possible for a group to change boundaries without General Assembly action. So they have the authority of the Assembly to change presbytery boundaries and only to change presbytery boundaries because there are places around the country that are looking at ways of realigning those boundaries to make them more effective. Again, most of these boundaries were set in the 1980s, if not before. So I think a lot of the boundaries up north were set in the 1960s, and Presbyterians have moved a lot. The church is very different now, so this will enable us to be a little more responsive to that. The General Assembly also approved a couple of matters related, or considered a couple of matters related to our relationships with our racial ethnic caucuses. It approved a large reimagining of Hispanic Latino ministry that will culminate in a 2026 discernment gathering that will establish new leadership development initiatives and congregational support programs for our Hispanic and Latino congregations. It considered a proposal related to the National Caucus of Korean Presbyterian Churches and deferred a decision on recognizing that group as an official racial ethnic caucus. They currently have access to the General Assembly structures through a broader group of Asian American caucuses, but they were asking for direct access to the structure. And that decision was deferred. I mentioned early on that this assembly considered new standing rules for the General Assembly meeting. If you weren't nerded out by presbytery boundaries, you would absolutely be nerded out around standing rules of the General Assembly. I will also note that I was on the committee that created these new standing rules and helped write a number of them. So uh, I got to speak my partiality toward them and be very clear. But these new rules help to bring the assembly into a new era designed to build in some additional flexibility, make it easier to do some of the work of the assembly electronically, some or even all of the work of the assembly electronically. First, it also as I mentioned, moves the election of the moderator or co-moderators to the end of the General Assembly meeting. It replaces the missionary advisory delegates and ecumenical advisory delegates. We have who advise the assembly on behalf of these two groups. They have an advisory vote and they have voice, but they do not have explicit space there uh, to vote. And those two categories of advisory delegates were replaced with a new group called partner advisory delegates. These persons come from partner organizations around the world, including our mission partners who work with our mission co-workers and our ecumenical partners. So that there's that shift in our representation. It also brought in a new process for selecting theological student advisory delegates. Historically, what TSADs, as they're known, are selected by seminaries. But more and more, our Presbyterian students are going to non-Presbyterian seminaries, and our Presbyterian seminaries are welcoming more non-Presbyterian students. So the assembly worked to simplify that process by bringing a nomination process through presbyteries rather than through seminaries. So anyone who is under care of a presbytery can apply. There were a number of other changes, but they are super wonky, super detailed. Uh, but the goal was ultimately to make more efficient and effective rules that were easier to understand. And if I say so myself, I think we did a pretty good job of that. The last thing to note is that this General Assembly did affirm that the next General Assembly in 2026 will be held in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and it will have the same format as this assembly. So we've tried a lot of different things in light of the pandemic. The 2020 assembly was an abbreviated assembly. It was all online and via Zoom. In 2022, the assembly met in person for committees and online for plenary. And in 2024, we reversed that and we were all online for committees and all in person for plenary. And so in 2026, we'll be in that latter format of committees will be online and the plenary will be in person. Just there was a lot of debate and discussion about that. And I think it's important to note that the cost of having a fully in-person General Assembly is adds $1 to the per capita per member at this point in time. But between all of the additional costs for meeting space and travel and hotel rooms, et cetera. So the General Assembly made the decision in light of that to leave the format in this way. And in 2026, they'll be considering proposals related to long-term format for the assembly. What's the most effective approach for the assembly's discernment? And that work is ongoing right now. I want to pause again and see if you have any questions on anything we talked about, anything else. The floor is open.
There's a lack of money behind most of these things, these changes.
I think the lack of money is not, it is, in some cases, it is the leading matter. In other cases, it is a contributing factor. Um, and I think the reality is it's not so much that people aren't paying per capita, that the rate of non-payment of per capita has pretty much stayed the same. So the per capita being the main way that we support the national church. The reality is that our membership numbers are just lower than what they were. And if we were to keep up doing what we have historically done, we have to raise the per member rate at a rate greater than inflation because we've gone from a denomination of 4 million when we reunited in 1983 to a denomination of 1 million in 2024. So I think that is the largest consideration is to a certain extent we're trying to right size what we do for a smaller church.
Well, per capita is not the only means of support for the various ministries of the church, national church.
That's
And I
right.
don't see much publicity on that. I mean, I see the publicity on that relates to the various offerings, but I'm talking about the general manner in which we are expected, though we may not participate, we are expected to make a contribution.
Mm. Hmm.
And why isn't anybody promoting that?
I think, that's a good question. There are national church people who would say we're absolutely promoting that. So it's a matter of whether it's getting through to people. Um, Support of large scale organizations across the board is more challenging these days. I will mention that is that people look for ways to support things that are closer to them and that are closer to home. And so that's what organizations around the country are experiencing right now, not just denominational structures. So, and some of that's just the realities we're in right now. I wish I could convince people to give more money, but even when we share the information that we need it, and we talk about what it goes to, they find other pathways for it. Well, I thank you all for joining us tonight for the recording. We hope if you need more information, you can reach me at cajames@atlpcusa.org. Happy to answer any questions you might have about the General Assembly. Thank you. Have a great evening.